Thanks for joining us here at Rose Quartz Mediumship podcast, where we simply adore anything and everything healing and metaphysically based. Recently, I was working with a client who was in a very emotional state. She was in the middle of processing an experience that she'd had with someone who was really important in her life. And she was struggling. And it was our second time speaking about that particular incident. And in the first time that we spoke about it, it was a very cognitive, cerebral, mind-based conversation. And in the second time that we were speaking about that event, she had really noticed that there was some disassociation happening. She was stuck in a little bit of freeze energy. She was disassociating from her body, almost leaving her body in a way. And as we spoke, well, first I want to say I suggested that she put a rock on her lap. Or maybe she suggested that, actually. Either way, she got a rock and she put it on her lap as a way to help ground her into her body, so that we could have a deeper conversation. And we started talking about the fact that she was disassociating. And in somatics, it's one of the important things that we do when someone is disassociating, is to associate them to the disassociation, to bring their awareness to the disassociation. And as we did that, she began to come back into her body a little bit. And we were exploring the experience and challenging the way that she was thinking about it. And she was doing an amazing job challenging her own thought patterns. She had originally started in one place and had made meaning out of the experience in one particular way. And she's a client who I work with enough that I knew she had the capability of challenging her own belief systems, the narratives that were happening in her own mind, and how to challenge them. So we were in the middle of that process, and she was telling me a different story, a different truth or potential truth. And she was doing a phenomenal job with it. And then she said, I think both of those stories could be true. And I said, let's see if there's a third story, right? And so she told a third story, or potential story, potential truth, that was a combination of those two. And we explored all three of those narratives and really looked at the schema or the stories that were connected to patterns of kinds of stories that she typically tells. And that's the thing. We all tell the same kind of story on repeat. And when you learn the particular flavor of the story that you tell, it becomes easier to recognize that you're stuck in the same schema or story that you typically tell. So she had 3 different options of stories that we were exploring. And then she really started to notice the awareness of her feet wanting to move. Her body was turning away from me. Her body was trying to get away from the conversation. And so we looked at her normal response to this kind of experience, or exploring this kind of experience, is a flight response, right? She tries to get away from or come out of contact with the experience or the memory of the experience. And so a couple of things are happening. We're challenging her stories. We're also bringing in the awareness that there is a story that she prefers, and then the pattern that she normally embodies to deal with this kind of difficult situation. Was a flight response, right? So there's a lot going on here in this session. And as we were exploring it, she said, my body is really shaking. It's shaking a lot, Erin. And so I know that I'm purging a lot of energy out of my body and out of my nervous system. Again, she's a client who I work with a lot. She has a lot of tools, a lot of skills, a lot of awareness. And this for me is such a fun space to be in with someone because they have enough awareness that they can really see things from the 30,000 foot view. It's like they kind of zoom out away from themselves and can see what they're doing. And as we really explored all these different dynamics, I said, what if the shaking is connected to you breaking this pattern? And she said, I think you might be right. And so I paused and explained it a little bit more, right? There is an overcoupling that happens in her nervous system that creates this pattern of flight. So when she's in these uncomfortable situations, an automatic response for her, this is the overcoupling part, is to try and get away, have a flight response. I'll just leave the environment. I'll just move away from it, right? I'll just be done with it all. And she wasn't doing that. She was challenging her own pattern by staying and having this conversation with me about this dynamic and not just saying, I'm done with it. Right? And so there's an overcoupling. And if you're not familiar with the term overcoupling, it means it's an automatic response in the nervous system. So when this happens, this automatically happens, right? It's an overcoupling. There's no choice there. This, and then this is the automatic response. There's no choice. And when we break an overcoupled dynamic, meaning when something's really uncomfortable, I'm going to give the example inside of this example, right? When something's really uncomfortable, when I've had a really uncomfortable conversation, my automatic response, the overcoupled response, is to leave, flight. And because she was staying, and because she was actually working through it and simultaneously observing the pattern that was trying to come out of her, the flight response that was trying to come out of her, and being able to really feel that, the embodied experience of wanting to leave, of her feet starting to shake and tap and her body turning away. She was feeling the experience. And she really turned and faced the experience and said, I'm staying here. I'm working through this. This is really important for me, not just in this dynamic, but for me as a human to break this pattern inside of myself. Because what she wanted was choice. She wanted the choice to leave if she wanted to leave or to stay if she wanted to stay. And when we have overcoupling, you don't have choice. And when we break overcoupling, there's almost always a significant purge of energy. And so her body was really shaking. And that shaking that she was experiencing was the decoupling, right? So then she was going to have choice. The breaking of that bond, so to speak, between uncomfortable conversation and automatic flight response. Those began to decouple and come apart, which is going to create the choice for her. She can leave after pausing and making a decision, or she can stay. Now she has choice, right? The shaking of her body was the purge as that came uncoupled, where she created choice inside of her body and inside of her nervous system. And the shaking is a purge of survival energy, and that happens when we uncouple things or decouple things. And so multiple things are happening here, right? She's challenging her own belief systems or her own schemas. She's observing them. She's breaking the pattern of the flight response, which is decoupling them. And because we were feeling it inside of the body, and she was noticing the sensation, the desire to leave, and what it felt like to stay, and the decoupling happened, she had a lot of energy leaving her body. And then she was able to really feel choice. And she was able to really feel different stories coming in. And she was able to recognize that that decoupling that was happening, there was the purge of the energy from the decoupling, but the magnitude of the emotion that she was feeling was not just connected to this experience, right? The magnitude of what she was working through was not just the experience that she'd been through. It had been every time that she had run, every time that she had left, every time that she had gone in the opposite direction and said, I'm done with that. She was feeling all of it. That's a lot to feel. It's a lot to feel. And when we have that kind of dynamic where we have a very ingrained pattern, and there's multiple patterns here happening, right? Hopefully you've kind of gotten that as I've broken this down a little bit. What happened for her is a huge purge of energy, but also a huge amount of emotion, because she was feeling everything that she hadn't been willing to feel before. Let's say there were 14 times where she had run in the opposite direction when something was really uncomfortable. Let's say just 14, right? It's a random number I picked. It's not the truth. It's just an example. It was 14 times that she didn't actually feel the magnitude of the experience that she was having. And so those kind of build on themselves, right? And so for her to sit and feel staying in this dynamic and working through this dynamic with this person who she was feeling very hurt by, she was also feeling all the times that she'd run and not been willing to feel it, because her automatic response was to get away from or come out of contact with the emotion, the sensations, the experience. And so you can understand how this experience felt enormous to her. And she had the conscious awareness. She really did. She was able to say, it shouldn't be this big. Why is this feeling so big for me, Erin? Meaning the emotions connected to this interaction that she'd had that didn't feel good. And the answer was so simple. It's because it's not just right now that you're feeling. And that's the thing about all triggers, right? When we are triggered, we're not just feeling the right here, right now. We're also feeling a similar dynamic before that had happened earlier in our lives. And so here she is feeling the magnitude of the emotion of 14 times of running and not feeling. So you can understand how this would be a really big emotional experience for her. And she didn't turn away. In fact, she turned and faced it and noticed her desire to turn away, to run away, to get away. And she worked through it. And when she worked through it, that decoupling of the overcoupled response, right? Uncomfortable conversation, I'm out of here, flight response. Those that were overcoupled, right? Here is the uncomfortable conversation, automatically is the flight response. When she chose to stay, when she challenged her own pattern, it decoupled them. And there was a massive purge of energy. Massive. And as her body started to come back down and calm back down, she was able to feel new truths in her body. She was able to feel herself and her connection to herself more deeply. And the next day when I followed up with her to see how she was feeling and doing, she said, I feel great. I feel like me. I feel like me again. And that is the power of somatics. Our nervous systems are really complicated and really simple all at the same time. When we know how to work with them versus against our nervous system, when we actually know how to work with our nervous system, we are able to create new pathways, new opportunities for being in the world and with ourselves differently. And that work that she did was enormous. Because not only did she have the decoupling, she broke her own pattern, she challenged her own belief systems, and she felt it all in her body and allowed the new truth after the purge of energy, the new truth to come in. And that is the new truth that is going to run in her nervous system. And now she has choice. It doesn't mean that she needs to stay. There will be dynamics where there's an uncomfortable conversation. She stays for the uncomfortable conversation. She's able to navigate through it. And then she says, I'm not accepting this. This is below the standard of what I find acceptable in my life. And I'm leaving. But it's a choice. It's not automatic. Or there might be an uncomfortable conversation and she stays because she has choice. She works through it and she stays. And she challenges her own belief systems and thought patterns and schemas that are running in the background of her mind and her nervous system and her body. Every now and then, someone will say to me, people don't change. And if I'm being honest, I used to say that same thing. People don't change. People change drastically. People change drastically when they're in the right environment with the right support. People change drastically. Their personalities change. Their identity changes. People change. Healing happens. And this was such a potent example of this beautiful combination of cognitive, cerebral, mind-based concepts and somatic, body-based, nervous system-based concepts at the same time. And the impact for her was huge. Because now she gets to choose. She has autonomy. She gets to decide. Her nervous system is no longer deciding. Her nervous system has decided that she gets choice. And this is the power of being able to work both cognitively, cerebrally with concepts, as well as somatically, right? So a top-down, bottom-up approach. Top-down refers to cognitive cerebral concepts. Bottom-up refers to somatic or body-based nervous system concepts. And when you can work from both directions with yourself, magic happens. And then you get to decide who you want to be, how you want to feel, and how you want to move through the world. And I wanted to share this experience because it is so powerful to know that you can change. You can change drastically. It's what healing is. And so if there are parts of you that you no longer want to accept, you can change. You can. And I hope that wherever it is that this podcast is reaching you, that you are having a beautiful morning, day, evening, or night.